All right. Well, good afternoon, and a warm welcome to all of you in the Brookings audience today. My name is Melanie Sisson. I'm a fellow in the Strobe Talbott Center for Security Strategy and Technology here at the Brookings Institution. And it's a real pleasure to be joined by this particular group of experts this afternoon. We have Bob Einhorn, Amy Nelson, Michael Hanlon, and Caitlin Talmadge. It's quite a collection. It's maybe akin to like the cast of a forthcoming Marvel movie on nuclear issues. And unfortunately, it's a good time to be pulling together groups of experts like this, deep thinkers on U.S. nuclear policy, because global events are prompting the U.S. national security community to, revisit some foundational principles of U.S. nuclear policy and to reevaluate nuclear strategy and posture. We're going to do similarly here today. We're going to do a little bit of revisiting before we move to that reevaluation. And I'd actually like to begin with you, Mike, to put this in a little bit of context, to put nuclear capability into context. What is the role of the U.S. nuclear arsenal in our national security strategy?
Thanks, Melanie, and hi, everybody. Big question, but let me just make a couple of points to get things going. One is that it's still quite large, quite central. And of course, people in this room, like the great Barry Bleckman and others who have written about Cold War U.S. defense strategy, know that and will remember that nuclear weapons were the cornerstone of our way of defending Europe in what was called the first offset, or the nuclear offset back in the day, because we didn't think we had the conventional forces. And then in the post-Cold War era, we've often thought of nuclear weapons at a lower priority, more in a non-proliferation context. But they're coming back in a way. And I hope the students and younger folk in the room will keep learning their nuclear strategy, because I'm afraid you're going to have to contend with some pretty big questions. Just a couple of examples. One is that in the late 2010s, the Pentagon leadership was in the habit of saying nuclear modernization is our top priority. And they basically have never changed that spiel even today. But they were emphatic. And this was the $1.4 trillion price tag for modernization of all three legs of the nuclear arsenal: land-based missiles, bombers, and submarines, as well as nuclear command and control, missile defense systems, cruise missiles, and the Department of Energy National Nuclear Security Administration activities to maintain the arsenal. So that's a pretty big price tag, even over a 20-year period. In the last few years, I think it's fair to say that we've tended to talk more and think more about conventional deterrence and making sure that with hypersonic weapons and swarming robotics and things like that, that we're not falling behind the Chinese, for example. And obviously, we're all watching what's going on in Ukraine and Russia and thinking about the employment of modern technologies combined with old technologies. But in regard to Russia, especially in the fall of 2022, there was a lot of concern that President Putin might react to Russia's defeats on the conventional battlefield with nuclear threats against NATO, and he made those threats, and maybe nuclear threats against Ukraine as well. And there were even concerns that had been documented in the unclassified literature that there were some actual initial preparations being made to employ weapons at a time when they weren't sure their conventional forces would suffice. And that would have raised all sorts of questions about what we would do. We weren't necessarily going to respond with nuclear weapons of our own if Russia used nuclear weapons within Ukraine, but there was talk about the United States attacking Russian Black Sea ships as a retaliatory response, and then who knows what Russia would do next. So that's a real-world example just in recent times of where nuclear weapons have been quite central. And the last thing I'll say, and this gets to a lot of Caitlin's research and ongoing important contributions, so it's just teeing up a subsequent conversation, but we're all watching the Chinese decide that being a minimalist nuclear power is no longer good enough for them. And those of you who study U.S.-China relations with Chinese military will know that really since Chinese acquisition of the nuclear bomb in the 1960s, China's been content to stay at a few dozen or now up to a couple hundred warheads. And that was their shtick all the way through roughly 2020. But now the Pentagon expects they'll have 1,500 nuclear weapons by the year 2035, and maybe 1,000 by the end of this decade. And people wonder what that's all about. And my simple answer, just as a provocation or a beginning on this, because I'm sure we'll come back to it, would be they're tired of letting us be in the position where we can make the nuclear threats against them. And they're worried that in a future Taiwan contingency, and I'm not giving them any license or any kind of credence that they should attack Taiwan just because they think it's theirs. But if we get into a conventional fight over Taiwan, and the United States decides to threaten nuclear weapons use because we've got 4,000 and they've just got 200. And even if we have no intention of actually using them, we think that making the threat may buy us something in the crisis management or the conflict resolution. The Chinese don't want to be in that position any longer. They don't want us to have the ability to go to a higher level of escalation, and specifically a nuclear threat, because our history in the Cold War is full of making those kinds of threats. And they know our history, and they know we've made threats against them over Taiwan and over Korea in the past. So I don't excuse the Chinese, and I don't say it's good for us that they are now deciding to try to catch up. It makes life a lot more complicated, including with arms control, as Amy has written, but it is in a way a natural reaction to the enduring centrality of nuclear weapons in superpower security relations.
Mike, as usual, you've packed a lot into your opening salvo, so many pieces to return to. Appreciate that, and I'm glad you referenced the numbers, and particularly the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Caitlin, I wanted to turn to you to talk about that number, and if you can give us a little bit of a history backgrounder into how have we thought about how big the U.S. nuclear arsenal needs to be?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for the question. It's nice to be here with all of you discussing these important issues. So as Mike mentioned, the structure of nuclear competition, I think, is changing in some important ways. And I think as we go on today, we'll talk about what some of those are and the implications. But it is important to kind of understand, well, changing from what baseline? And, to state the obvious, the U.S. nuclear arsenal, the size of it, the composition of it, really came about in a very particular sort of geopolitical environment, which was the environment of bipolarity, a situation in which the United States really was only concerned about one other very powerful nuclear armed state, which of course was the Soviet Union. And, it was the need to have survivable nuclear forces vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, forces that could credibly promise to defend the Allies and the commitments we had made to them in Europe, and that could convince the Soviets that there was no circumstance under which they could first strike the United States and not expect devastating retaliation, that the United States made the decisions that it made throughout the Cold War about both how big its arsenal should be, so the quantitative piece, but also what other qualitative capabilities it should have in terms of survivability, precision, basing, all of those things that go into the larger question of the nuclear balance between two states. And that really was pretty constant throughout the Cold War. China, as Mike very nicely teed up, did become an independent nuclear power during the Cold War, but with a very minimal arsenal that, as far as I can tell from my own research, never really had much of an impact on either the quantitative or the qualitative force posture decisions that the United States was making during the Cold War. It factored into some of our calculations in the PSYOP, which is a whole other story we can talk about. But basically, there was one game in town, it was the Soviets. And the Cold War ended, and the process of strategic arms control that went along with that resulted in major reductions in the size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, and concomitantly in the Soviets as well. And the remaining nuclear threats were kind of seen as lesser included cases of what the United States might need to deal with its much smaller residual nuclear arsenal. And that's kind of where the United States found itself in recent times as it's undergone the beginning of a modernization program, and it's looking out at the nuclear landscape now, and really seeing that it's no longer in a purely bipolar nuclear environment. It's in an environment of multiple nuclear actors.
So you've mentioned, the Cold War was an incredibly rich period of conceptual thinking about nuclear issues. You mentioned the idea of credibility, and to access that from a slightly different direction, a straightforward question that hopefully you can answer equally straightforwardly, or at least give it a good college try, as they say. The United States does not have a no first use policy. Can you explain why that is?
Sure. The simplest explanation or answer I could give as to why the United States has never adopted a no first use policy is that it's a policy that our allies would believe and our adversaries wouldn't. And what I mean by that is, the United States does have these extended deterrence commitments, which, particularly in the Cold War, for reasons Mike outlined, when the United States faced very severe conventional imbalance vis-a-vis the Soviets on the Central Front in Europe, the United States very much envisioned engaging in the first use of nuclear weapons to defend those allies. And people forget that, and I think also forget that there are scenarios today in which we don't talk about it in polite company, but the ability to make credible nuclear threats of first use against aggressors, against U.S. allies, does remain an important part of our extended deterrence commitments. And so there's a real concern that were the United States to pledge to never, under any circumstances, be the first to use nuclear weapons, that would be alarming for allies who, have foregone their own nuclear weapons based on the promise that they will be under the American nuclear umbrella. This is something that my colleagues here also know a lot about. I know your opening, you said it was straightforward, but it wasn't. I think there's a lot there. But, I think allied resistance to that sort of policy is a major reason it hasn't been adopted. And then on the flip side, I myself have done a recent research project on this that's coming out in the next issue of International Security, looking at the empirical cases we actually have of states that have adopted nuclear no first use pledges, because this has happened. The Indians have done it, the Chinese have done it, and the Soviets did it toward the end of the Cold War. And, the empirical record basically demonstrates that in the cases where nuclear no first use pledges are most needed, those are the cases where they are typically not perceived as credible by the adversaries to whom they are made. And, that's for a variety of reasons. But states basically look much less at declaratory policy than they do at actual nuclear capability in determining whether they think their adversary might engage in nuclear first use. So I don't know how straightforward that was, but allies believe it, adversaries don't.
I think it counts. So thank you.
Okay, I tried.
Amy, Caitlin did mention the arms control initiatives, the regimes that were developed during the Cold War. And it is the case that in addition to being concerned about the quantity and quality that the United States possessed, we were concerned about the quality and quantity that we were willing not to possess over time. That's probably a much clumsier way of fashioning it than you are about to do. But could you give us a refresher on arms control, about how and why it began and what really it was designed to do?
Sure. Arms control, as we know it today, in the form of, let's say, legally binding treaties that place limitations on the nuclear arsenals of states, really grew out of early Cold War efforts to ban testing and ban the development of these weapons. And it became clear that no side was willing to either share the technology or give it up entirely. And I think we've seen that decision bear out, because multiple states since then have also acquired nuclear weapons. So there was a fork in the road: share the technology and or give up the technology, or place a ban on its further development, stopping the technology in its tracks. So the US gets a bomb, the Soviet Union gets a bomb, and we stop right there. But that's never how weapons development or innovation goes. And coming over the horizon was the hydrogen bomb, and the hydrogen bomb really forced the United States into another kind of decision moment, and they decided to also produce the hydrogen bomb, and the arms race was on and arms control was off. This was until the early 60s, when thinking coming out of, let's call it the Cambridge Consensus, really started informing policy, how we think about the stabilizing effect of nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction, which side has an incentive to strike first, and really the cultivation of arms control as a tool to sort of codify circumstances that would disincentivize either side from striking first, really sort of emerged and reified itself through a series of arms control treaties. We call this sometimes the SALT process. SALT I led to SALT II, all the way up through to the contemporary version of New START. And over time, these ended up being agreements that at first froze the number of, let's say, offensive nuclear weapons each side could have, along with other defensive agreements, confidence and security building measures, CSBMs, and the quantitative path continued with the idea that in mind that we might someday get to a point where we could eliminate all nuclear weapons. Obviously, we're not at that point right now. In fact, we're going in a different direction. Not only has arms control fallen on hard times, the number of treaties eroded, withdrawn from, no longer in existence, but we are now having very serious conversations about increasing the size of the U.S. arsenal.
So in addition to worrying about our own arsenal, the arsenal of a peer, Bob, we also worried about the possession of nuclear weapons by non-peer actors in the international system. And so nonproliferation has been an enduring and prominent feature of U.S. foreign policy. Tell us a bit about that, about the whys and wherefores.
Thank you, Melanie, and thanks all of you for joining us today. Nuclear proliferation became a serious U.S. concern really in the 1960s. President John Kennedy was the first U.S. president really to articulate this concern, and I'm going to quote him here. In July 1963, Kennedy urged Americans, and I'll quote him now, to stop and think for a moment what it would mean to have nuclear weapons in so many hands, in the hands of countries large and small, stable and unstable, responsible and irresponsible, scattered throughout the world. There would be no rest for anyone, no stability, no real security, and no chance for effective disarmament. Since the 1960s, every U.S. administration, Republican or Democratic, has placed high priority in stopping the spread of nuclear weapons, and they did so for a number of reasons. They believe that hostile states with nuclear weapons would be emboldened to act aggressively in their regions against U.S. allies and U.S. interests. They also believe that an increase in the number of states with nuclear weapons would increase the probability that nuclear weapons would eventually be used, whether intentionally or as a result of accident or misperception. They also believed that the dispersion of nuclear weapons and nuclear materials around the world could eventually lead to what we now call loose nukes and an increase in the risk of nuclear terrorism. Although U.S. officials don't really advertise this, the United States believed that additional numbers of centers of nuclear decision-making would make it more difficult for the United States to shape and control events in a less predictable and a more multipolar world. And so for all of these reasons and more, this became a top national security priority for the United States. Now, nuclear nonproliferation interests have not always prevailed against competing American interests. At a certain point, the United States decided not to oppose Israel's nuclear program because it understood the Israeli need to have a deterrent against large Arab conventional armies that were bent on the destruction of Israel. Later on, in the George W. Bush administration, it decided to engage in nuclear cooperation with India, reversing long-standing nonproliferation policy in the hope that this would strengthen a U.S.-Indian strategic partnership to counter China. I think that was a naive consideration, but for the time being, it trumped nonproliferation. But by and large, U.S. administrations have sought to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and not just in the case of adversaries, but in the case of U.S. allies and partners.
Bob, can you give us, there's obviously a case-by-case sort of assessment to be made, but if you had to give a broad stroke about how effective U.S. nonproliferation policies have been, how would you characterize that?
I think it's been extraordinarily effective. Nonproliferation is hard, especially if you have a resourceful country that has a strong national security justification for getting nuclear weapons. But despite that, we've done amazingly well. 30 years ago, there were 9 countries with nuclear arms. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council: India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. 30 years later, there are still 9 countries, despite all kinds of predictions that there would be a cascade of proliferation. In that period, Saddam Hussein was interested, the Ayatollahs of Iran were interested, Gaddafi in Libya, there were, Argentina and Brazil were pursuing nuclear weapons. There were real concerns at the time, but despite all that, there are still 9. Maybe we'll go into what's going to happen in the future. It's been a great record. Whether it will be sustained depends on a number of factors that we'll, I'm sure, discuss.
Could I add one point on that very briefly, which is this is one of the reasons why I think we owe Ukraine a debt of gratitude and strategic gratitude, not just personal. They gave up their arsenal after the Cold War, partly because they were persuaded by us and others that the international security order would protect them even in the absence of a bomb. I doubt very much that Russia would have attacked Ukraine 2 years ago. If Ukraine had kept those weapons, they would have had to rejigger them to actually make them usable. But they helped us advance this nonproliferation agenda in 1994 by agreeing to give up the bomb, which I think is often forgotten in the debate, where it's all about how are we going to help Ukraine. But part of why they need the help is because they helped us 30 years ago in a crucial way.
And I'm going to get ahead. I'm going to jump the queue for a second and add on to what Mike said. Despite all that, despite people thinking that if Ukraine had not given up its, and it really didn't have nuclear weapons, but gave up its nuclear inheritance, if it hadn't done that, it would have been safe today. Russia wouldn't have attacked. But today, given all that's happened in the last 2 years, there's some Ukrainian parliamentarians who are saying maybe we should revisit that decision on nuclear. But I am convinced that they would come to the same conclusion today that they did back in 1994, that it's not in their interest to have nuclear weapons. It's more in their interest to join the West, whether European Union, they want to join NATO, but that's more in their interest than having nuclear weapons. But anyway, we can talk about that.
Assuming they survive long enough to do that.
Well, we'll certainly return to some of this, and because we are now going to transition into talking about today and what the world looks like today and the pressures it puts on nuclear policy today. So, Mike, back to you. Can you give us, please, a sort of a broad assessment of the international environment today and the implications that you see for U.S. nuclear strategy?
Well, let me just focus on one, since I just made the point about Ukraine. Let me just talk again about China and the importance of China building up its arsenal, which, again, I consider to be undesirable from the point of view of an American strategist, but not irresponsible on the part of China. I think if I were a Chinese strategist, I would see the case. This is different from certain other kinds of Chinese behavior that I do find objectionable. And you're writing a very important book about helping us make the distinction between, where China's rise is going to make life more complicated for the United States, but it doesn't always mean that what it's doing is irresponsible or otherwise reckless. But it does make life harder. Amy and I have written about this together, and a lot of her research is on this as well. Where do you go in arms control, strategic arms control, when you've got now 3 major powers to reckon with? And 2 of them are pretty closely aligned at the moment against us. It's not to say that China and Russia are going to fight for each other necessarily. I don't think they will. And nor do I think China is just sort of Russia's lackey, giving them whatever they want in the Ukraine context, because China has not provided Russia with arms, as best we know, until this point. But they have provided a lot of technology and a lot of revenue, and the 2 countries are largely aligned. And so I think this fundamentally complicates American strategic planning. At the moment, we haven't really thought that we need to change the size of the arsenal, but as Amy just mentioned, that debate could be coming. But then do we really want to try to match China and Russia combined? And why do we think they would accept that outcome? Now, admittedly, Russia doesn't have that big of a manufacturing base, but it's pretty good at making certain types of things like weapons. And China certainly can make a lot of things. So I don't know that we want to get into this arms race. I think the number of weapons that we have right now is probably in the right ballpark for being able to deter both in terms of the target set that it could be applied against in each country. But there's this perceptual problem that if it looks to the world like China and Russia collectively are on the rise at our expense, that's going to make a lot of American strategists think we've got to do something different. So I think I would just put on the table 2 initial thoughts on how we can begin to think about this. One, don't forget that France and Britain and frankly, to some extent, even India, are more on our side than China's and Russia's. So when we're doing the math, keep those kinds of other parties as part of the conversation. But secondly, stay open-minded about whether deployment of certain modest-sized missile defenses could actually be a better response than enlarging the offensive arsenal. And we've never wanted to base missile defense systems on the idea of countering a Chinese or Russian capability. As we all know, that logic is what led to the ABM treaty in the first place, because we felt it would lead to an offense-defense arms race. So I'm not talking about building a big enough national missile defense that we could theoretically stop a Russian or Chinese attack. But I am talking about one that maybe should be sized to at least complicate a Russian or Chinese attack. And when you do the math, make the math more complicated than just seeing that China and Russia now have 7,000 warheads between them, and we've still got only 4,000, and doesn't that make the world uncomfortable for us? So I want to sort of encourage that we mix the offensive and defensive debates, at least think it through, whether there's some options there.
Amy, did you have something to jump in on?
Yeah, I just want to say, just building off what Mike just said, when we treat nuclear weapons like a math problem, we're doomed to fail. It's not a math problem. Because if it were a math problem, we would be talking about the use of nuclear weapons and how many survive at the end. But of course, we know that nobody wins a nuclear war, and the point of nuclear weapons is to deter. What it means to deter now is very different than what it meant when we first built up our nuclear arsenal. And I think it's a much more complicated strategic picture. That said, it is so complicated, it is difficult to know right now what will deter, but I'm convinced that this is not a numbers game.
Caitlin, let's bring you in on this, because Mike did bring up at least one number that I want to address, which is 2, Russia and China, sometimes called the 2 nuclear peer problem. So please, I'd invite you to share your thoughts on that.
Thanks. Well, I'm finding myself in violent agreement with a lot of the interventions that have just been made, because, just to pivot off the point that Amy just made, I agree that, just because you have 2 nuclear peers doesn't mean that you suddenly do the arithmetic of who has the most warheads. I noted in my opening remarks that the United States quantitatively drew down its arsenal at the end of the Cold War in the absence of a serious nuclear peer competitor. But one thing it never stopped doing was making qualitative improvements in its nuclear forces. Those just chugged along like the little engine that could for the last 30 years. And the United States, I would argue, irrespective of what the numbers are, in a numbered comparison, has incredible advantages in terms of survivability, accuracy, precision, all of which figure into this question of the nuclear balance and what it actually takes to deter any given actor. So I think Amy's point is very well taken, and Mike's as well, that this is not just a simple question of having more warheads than the Russians and the Chinese do combined. And let's not forget the North Koreans also. But with that being said, to the point that Melanie just raised, I do think it is almost impossible to understate the dramatic nature of the structural change we are seeing in the nature of nuclear competition today as compared to the Cold War, because of the larger number of actors. And it's not just the emergence of 2 nuclear armed peers in Russia and China. It's also the intersection of great power nuclear competition with regional nuclear competitions involving North Korea, involving India and Pakistan. You have many fewer nuclear weapons in the world today than you did at the end of the Cold War, when the superpowers were drawing down arsenals that numbered in the tens of thousands. Yet the number of actors who control those weapons is far greater. And so that really creates this more complicated environment. I don't think it's obvious that all of the effects of the 2-peer problem are necessarily destabilizing. I mean, I think that the potential effects of having a 3-way nuclear competition can, cut in some different directions. If you think about a world in which a state has to worry about not just 1 nuclear armed adversary, but 2, there are some ways in which you might expect that to actually strengthen general deterrence. That is, to strengthen the incentives that any rational state has to simply avoid deliberately starting any kind of nuclear conflict. Why? Because if you actually get into the worst case scenario of a nuclear war with one opponent, there's a third opponent out there, there's a third actor out there that's sitting out that nuclear conflict that you potentially become much more vulnerable to in the aftermath of the war that's had its arsenal left intact. And all of the states in the system are aware of that, which would seem to really strongly inhibit the already strong, really strongly enhance the already strong incentives to just avoid getting into nuclear conflicts, right? So you can think about this sort of world as one in which, on the one hand, there are strong incentives, stronger than ever, to avoid deliberately initiating conflict with a nuclear-armed adversary, while at the same time, I can imagine that if such a conflict were to break out, if you actually did have a crisis involving two nuclear-armed states, or God forbid, a conventional war between two nuclear-armed states, that the unfolding of that war, the management of escalation in that war could actually be dramatically more complicated because, again, there's a presence of one or more other nuclear-armed actors out there in the system. So think about trying to use your nuclear forces to signal resolve or to signal de-escalation vis-a-vis one adversary at the same time that there's another adversary out there who may be reading those nuclear signals in a totally different way. Think about a world in which you might actually end up with more than one crisis involving nuclear-armed actors at the same time. I mean, I will remind you that in the fall of 2022, we had Russian saber rattling over Zaporizhia at the same time that we had Chinese saber rattling over the Pelosi visit to Taiwan. The notion that you could get two simultaneous or nearly simultaneous crises involving nuclear actors, I think, is actually not that far-fetched in a world with so many more nuclear actors. And so I think the potential for escalation through misperception, miscalculation, flawed signaling is higher, even if the incentives to avoid such conflict in the first place on a rational basis are actually higher. And so, this is the kind of stuff I think we should be thinking about, because these are all just problems that result from the structure of the situation being fundamentally different from the two-player game that we began the conversation talking about.
Well, let's talk internal to that structure a little bit. We touched on Ukraine a little bit earlier, and you've just mentioned saber rattling. Talk to us a little bit about nuclear coercion in crises of the nature that you've just described, or even concretely what you make of the nuclear coercion in the Ukraine case. Caitlin, if we start with you, and if others want to chime in from there.
So I guess my take on nuclear escalation issues in Ukraine in general is that it's a little bit more of a success story for the U.S. than is often recognized. I mean, I think it's a great case of all these bad things that didn't happen in terms of the Russians escalating. They have made nuclear threats. There has been nuclear saber rattling. But you've also seen them back down from the precipice, I think in part because of smart interventions by the U.S., communications to the Russians about the consequences, were they to escalate in the nuclear dimension. And also because I think the U.S. has actually had a smartly graduated policy in terms of the limits of its intervention in the conflict and support to Ukraine. And so I think again, it's a case where I think maybe the Biden administration doesn't get credit for the escalation that didn't happen. I also think it's a situation where we often hear a lot of talk about how threats of Russian escalation have limited U.S. support to Ukraine or curtailed what it's been willing to do, while there's often much less discussion about how the U.S. nuclear umbrella, I think, has also been very effective in limiting Russian incursions onto NATO soil and Russian escalations that it could have inflicted on, U.S. friends in the region. And so, I think it illustrates the fact that we do have to contend with this world in which there are revisionist nuclear-armed actors who may try to use the cover of their nuclear weapons to make conventional gains. And I think that's a real problem we have to worry about in the Pacific as well. But I wouldn't say I'm heartened, but I am a little bit more optimistic based on the last 2 years about our ability to manage this very scary problem than maybe others are.
I'll invite somebody, but Mike, did you have a similar, different view?
Well, I don't know if it's different, but it's just broadening the conversation to other cases, partly based on Caitlin's own research, because we also need to bear in mind, as her research underscores, that whatever rational actor analysis may lead us to believe, there are dynamics in wars that are not always easily controlled. And one of the things she's written about, and Barry Bleckman and Barry Posen and a lot of other great scholars, is the interaction between conventional and nuclear forces and command and control, and the idea that you may not even know if the other side is thinking about using nuclear weapons. You may convince yourself they're about to and start to take actions that then try to preempt that threat, or you may undertake conventional attacks that destroy the same warning systems that they would have used to see nuclear attacks coming, and they get itchy trigger fingers about that. So the world is complicated. It's why so many Brookings scholars of earlier generations, like the great Bruce Blair and Jan Nolan and John Steinbrunner, really were interested in reducing the role of nuclear weapons in international security, because even if rational actor analysis might lead you to think these things shouldn't be used and the threats and dangers can be managed, there are a lot of things that are not completely rational about the way in which military organizations operate, especially in wartime. So that would be one key point. And then secondly, just to reinforce it and to build on a little country we haven't talked about much except in passing, Caitlin, North Korea. North Korea has recently developed a more assertive nuclear doctrine. Bob Einhorn knows this issue extremely well, so he may want to amend or correct me. But in the last decade or so, the United States and South Korea have developed war plans that, from what we see in the public debate, war plans that envision a more rapid preemption and decapitation approach against North Korean leadership in the event of war, because we know full well that North Korea now has nuclear arsenals or nuclear weapons of its own, and unless we're able to get at that arsenal very early, it might be used. Unfortunately, these war plans leaked to the press, and Kim Jong-un knows about them now, and he knows that we're going to target him, or at least according to some of the press reports about these plans, early in a crisis, which means that he has now said, be careful, because I'm going to target you faster than you can target me. So now we go towards more of a hair trigger as opposed to less. So I'm glad Caitlin's here to let everybody get some good messages that help them sleep at night, and she's right. But there are other messages, other recent stories, and other dynamics that could be scarier.
Well, let's turn to you now, Bob, and talk a little bit about the implications of this structurally changed, somewhat heartened, but also terribly frightening geopolitical environment, and what you see when you look out at the landscape for nonproliferation, and any of the other concerns you'd like to pick up on.
Well, a few minutes ago, I mentioned that our nonproliferation policy has been remarkably successful. Only 9 nuclear armed states after so much speculation. Now there are many people who believe that given the changes in this international security environment, this may all change. And I'll mention a couple of features of this environment which could change that picture. Now you have several nuclear-armed states rapidly building up their nuclear capabilities and conducting aggression or taking provocative actions against non-nuclear neighbors. You have Russia in Ukraine and threatening nuclear use. You have China rapidly building up both conventional and nuclear forces and bullying its neighbors in the East and South China Sea and on the island of Taiwan. You've got North Korea, as Mike said, with no intention whatsoever to give up its nuclear capabilities. But threatening to use nuclear weapons preemptively if it perceives that its leadership is under threat. And of course, you have Iran, which is not a nuclear-armed state, at least not yet, but it's a near-nuclear state, and it's acting aggressively in its region and perhaps motivating others in the region to acquire their own nuclear capabilities. That's one feature. Another, I think, important feature is that with the highly adversarial U.S.-Chinese and U.S.-Russian relations, we no longer have China and Russia as partners in preventing nuclear proliferation. They used to be partners. Cooperating closely with the United States in the Iran nuclear deal and in seeking denuclearization of North Korea. They joined the United States in voting against very harsh UN Security Council sanctions against Iran and North Korea, but no longer. China and Russia now see Iran and North Korea as strategic partners against the United States. They help both countries evade sanctions, evade existing sanctions, and they veto new sanctions. Russia is now receiving arms supplies from both Iran and North Korea to wage war in Ukraine. So it's hard to imagine now that Russia is going to join with the United States to help rein in the nuclear capabilities of these countries. A third feature that I think is problematic is that there's been an erosion, and it's happened over a long period of time. There's been an erosion of the credibility on the part of U.S. allies and partners in the reliability of the U.S. Security guarantees to them. The Biden administration has worked very hard to try to restore that credibility, to show that the U.S. nuclear umbrella is still working, that they were reliable allies. But U.S. allies and partners, both in Europe and in Northeast Asia, are alarmed at the prospect of a return to power of Donald Trump. Given his dismissive and transactional approach to U.S. Alliances. But it's not just their worries about Trump. They're also worried that the American public is no longer interested in its overseas commitments and overseas military presence. And they're afraid that whoever wins the November election, the U.S. public is going to become less tolerant of the kind of assurances that they have received in the past. And if they're no longer being protected by the United States, there's a reasonable chance that they're going to start looking to rethink their nuclear options.
Amy, what about for arms control? I think there is a growing awareness that there are implications of these geopolitical, geostrategic changes for arms control. Unfortunately, the questions I hear being asked are things like, is arms control dead? Does arms control have a future? So you're a big thinker. Please help us understand the implications of the environment for arms control.
Well, I think the State Department line is arms control is a tool. How can a tool be dead? That doesn't make any sense, right? How do we restrain ourselves in these times in a meaningful way, in a way that makes a contribution to security? Is restraint still the name of the game? Well, first, I don't think there's any arms control to be done right now, and certainly not while the Ukraine war is going on. I think we've seen an erosion of the existing arms control architecture, which had multiple causes. And I think that the arms control architecture was a project that took place over a period of time in a geopolitical era, and it was designed to suit the needs of that era. So I think we will do arms control again, and by arms control I mean anything that improves the security of states, pretty much anything that increases security, that lowers uncertainty, and that stabilizes the international system. I just think the arms control of the future is going to look very different from the arms control of the past, that whereas quantitative limitations, for one, served the US and Soviet Union well in creating a stable environment during the Cold War, I don't think quantitative reductions have the same impact in this day and age. So that's number one. Number two, I just don't think we're going to do any arms control in the foreseeable future. And by that, I mean any legally binding treaties. There are smaller things we can do to increase transparency, lower uncertainty, build up a repertoire, for example, of shared concepts so that we have shared understandings about what kind of actions, what kind of statements are perceived as destabilizing. But I think the task at hand now is to lay the groundwork for the arms control regime of the future, for when we come back to the negotiation table. What does arms control look like 10 to 15 years from now?
I'm going to, in a moment, invite our in-person audience here to raise some questions to the panel. So start thinking while I ask this group one last question. And I'm going to start from Bob and go that way. Same question for all of you, though, or at least the request, not so much a question. But please offer no less than one and no more than three recommendations, either for questions that U.S. policymakers really need to be asking today, or for what we should actively be doing to decrease nuclear risk.
Okay, number one, we should, and Caitlin and Mike and Amy have all alluded to this, we need to reinforce confidence in the reliability of the U.S. extended deterrent. Concerns are about, would South Korea go nuclear? Would Japan go nuclear? They're less likely to go nuclear if we can convince them that our guarantees are reliable. So that, and we're also talking about some of our European allies, the frontline states on the borders of Russia. They need to be reassured. Number two, we need to prevent Iran from actually getting nuclear weapons. They're a threshold nuclear weapon state now, and we have to deter them from making this decision to go from threshold to actual possession of nuclear weapons. I think seeking to negotiate a new JCPOA or something comparable, there's very little prospect of that. I think the best hope is to maintain the credible threat of the use of military force, if necessary, to stop Iran from breaking out and actually weaponizing its nuclear capabilities. And third, we shouldn't give up on diplomacy altogether. But it would be diplomacy to pursue nuclear risk reduction measures with some nuclear adversaries to reduce the likelihood of nuclear war by accident, misperception, and to alleviate some of the concerns of our allies and partners. We should try to, also through diplomacy, to get Iran to restore some of the IAEA monitoring arrangements that they've been shedding in recent times, because we have to have the best early warning of any Iranian attempt to break out and get nuclear weapons, so we can preempt that attempt. And finally, in the Middle East, I think we need to promote Israeli-Saudi normalization of relations. We need to build a coalition of like-minded countries to counter Iran and its proxies. And if we do, I think we'll reduce motivations by countries like Saudi Arabia and perhaps others in the region to acquire their own nuclear deterrence.
Great, thanks. In the arms control sphere or domain, I think we need to think harder about arms control as information management or uncertainty management. We can't eradicate every threat. We can't control every risk. What we need to do is prioritize the risks that are most destabilizing. And this is increasingly a function of the information we have. And we have this long, rich history and literature about how misperceptions cause war, but we have the entire information domain now layered on top of it. So stabilizing international systems is increasingly a function of kind of information dominance. And so who controls that information wins the stability game. I think we also just need to think differently about the risks we face. We have too many potential threats coming at us, and to think holistically in the same way we did during the Cold War about risk mitigation. What are acceptable risks, and why do we avoid certain risks that just seem too difficult to tackle, too quantitatively complex?
Great, thank you, Mike.
3 ideas from arms control. One, I would like to propose that when possible, we think about reviving the open skies arrangement that we used to have with the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, and I think we should include China the next time around. Jim Steinberg and I wrote about this 10 years ago, and I'd like to see some kind of version of that happen. We know how to protect our truly secretive technologies from airplanes overhead. We've proven that for many years, so there's nothing wrong about this idea, and it could be a modest confidence-building measure. Secondly, Amy and I wrote last year that if and when it becomes possible to start talking with the Russians again about New START, which they've suspended in their own compliance at the moment, that in keeping with the spirit of what she's been saying about information, that we invite other countries to join New START, not so much with the quantitative restrictions, but with the information sharing and transparency and inspection mechanisms, so that we begin to just use future arms control as a vehicle for improving transparency. I would keep the quantitative limits on Russia and the United States, but not ask other countries to necessarily do more than simply share their planning and open their facilities to inspections as that regime already has established. And then finally, I think that more generally in war planning, the United States needs to bear in mind that we cannot rely on nuclear escalation or the threats of escalation to prevail against China, and therefore the fundamental, in addition to improving our conventional forces, but I'm not sure we can improve them enough to guarantee victory over a Taiwan scenario, we need to continue down this path that Secretary Austin calls integrated deterrence, making sure that we're resilient enough and the Chinese fear enough the possibility of economic warfare as well as military conflict that China just doesn't want to try its luck at taking Taiwan. And I think there's still elements of thinking within the broader U.S. strategic community that assume that somehow we'd find a way to win or escalate our way to victory. I don't think that's necessarily true.
Thanks. Caitlin.
So I agree with my colleagues that arms control is not on the horizon for the foreseeable future. And the main reason, I think, is that our adversaries don't really see any reason that it would be in their interest right now. I mean, the big burst of arms control that you get in the second half of the Cold War is because the Soviets start to realize the competition's really dangerous, and also they can't keep up. And so I think the question for U.S. policymakers is, how can we position ourselves with the size and composition of our nuclear forces to actually put some of that pressure, perhaps, on adversaries and convince them that there is an interest in coming to the table. I think policymakers should seriously look at the size and composition of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, which was developed in a completely different threat environment and arms control environment than the one we have now. I think it would be remarkable if 1550 deployed strategic warheads was magically the exact same composition that was appropriate for the current environment. And I don't know what the right number is. It isn't just a math equation, as Amy pointed out, but do you want to buy more Columbias? Do you want to MIRV the Sentinel? I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of ideas out there about how you might get more capability in the modernization program. Second, in the short term, I think that the United States could be doing some things to signal to the Russians in particular, but also the Chinese, that if they don't come to the table on arms control, the United States is not necessarily going to stay at 1550 even in the short term. So, do you want to reconvert some of those launch tubes on SSBNs and make them usable again? Do you want to reconvert some of the B-52s that were given conventional only capability as part of arms control at the end of the Cold War? Maybe you don't want to do it. Maybe you just want to demonstrate that you could do it or signal that you're thinking about doing it. And third, I would say some recapitalization of DoD and NNSA capability is long overdue in general. Talking about running an unconstrained arms race, like the United States can't do that right now because of plutonium pit production issues. So, I think doing some of those things would actually position the United States to convince adversaries that not having an unconstrained competition actually is something that's in their interest too.
All right, well, let's turn to our audience here. Please indicate if you have a question that you would like to ask, and microphones will come around. So we have a person here in the front. Please introduce yourself and keep your question concise, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Yusuke Shimizu. I work for the World Bank, but I used to work for the Japanese Foreign Ministry, including the Division of North Korea and our mission to the UN. My question with regards to, I heard a lot of insights with regard to bilateral or trilateral regimes, but what about multilateral regimes such as the NPT, the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, CTBT, et cetera, which has been quite stagnant for a long time? Should that be a priority going forward? That's my question.
Takers? Mike?
I'll do CTBT. Thanks for the question. As you know, arms control is not really dead because we still have a number of things that are in place, either officially or pragmatically. And the CTBT, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, is one of them, even though the United States has never ratified. And it's also China that hasn't, right? Or is it one other major power? Is it China or Russia? I'm forgetting. In any event, which?
China.
China. So in the actual reality of the world, the only country that's tested nuclear weapons this century is North Korea. And we should want to keep it that way. And so there'll be, Putin's been threatening to test. And I wouldn't be surprised if he did. It doesn't mean we have to test back. And we had Frank Rose on stage a few weeks ago, then at that time the Deputy Director of the National Nuclear Security Administration, to say the United States has no plans, no intentions, and no need to test nuclear weapons. It's very confident in the stockpile stewardship program and has a great deal of confidence from the lab directors in Los Alamos, Livermore, Sandia, and elsewhere that our current arsenal is safe and dependable. So I think we should reinvigorate our own commitment to non-testing, even if it's not going to be plausible that we would ratify the treaty per se in the near future.
I think we can do another audience question. There's a person over on the side with glasses.
Hi, Andrew Yo, Senior Fellow, Center for Asia Policy Studies here at Brookings. This event was billed as nuclear challenges for the next administration. Whether it's a Republican or a Democratic administration, these are definitely challenges. There was more of a bipartisan consensus in the past on things like arms control and nuclear nonproliferation, but I'm curious if any of you have an understanding of perhaps new developments in Republican foreign policy strategy or the MAGA wing, what their thoughts or views are on arms control and nonproliferation. Thanks.
Speaking of rational
You takers?
Sure. I've heard the new way of thinking referred to as the new nuclear consensus in lieu of the arms control consensus, the implication being that arms control is dead and or not possible right now. And what we really need to do is bulk up our nuclear arsenal to deter to peer threats at the same time. I think we're moving further and further apart in terms of Democrats and Republicans on nuclear policy, in short.
I think we can fit in one last question if there is one. Okay, we've got a person up here in a green vest, sweater, jacket.
Hi, my name's Derek Boyd. It seems to me that, in fact, the move towards isolationism in US policy is probably the most destabilizing factor in the nuclear field, because the United States has this nuclear umbrella which stabilizes the world very strongly. If it is withdrawn, this will create a lot of panic in many parts of the world. And it's not clear what will come out of that panic. So I was wondering what your ideas about this are.
The panic is already beginning. You have, I mean, there are even lawmakers in Germany who are saying that Germany ought to consider having nuclear weapons. You have European politicians talking about a European nuclear force if they can no longer rely on the U.S. nuclear umbrella. 70% of the population of South Korea says they favor nuclear armament by Seoul. So yes, it is a problem, and underlying it is the concern about U.S. isolationism, and not just Trump. As I mentioned in my remarks, it's not just Trump. It's about the attitude of the U.S. public. You know, I mentioned in my remarks, the Biden administration has done a good job to restore U.S. credibility, but they can only do so much when you have an election coming up in November. Hopefully, you know, if Trump were to become president, hopefully he would have enough of an advisory group who would recognize some of the implications of America First for the nuclear world of the future.
Can I just add a really quick footnote on that? I agree with Bob's concerns, but I would also say that as long as we have not just alliances on paper, but forward-stationed U.S. military forces in key parts of the world, it makes it relatively hard for an aggressor to convince themselves they can attack a South Korea or a Latvia or a Poland and get away with it, and that not have the United States ultimately decide under whatever president with whatever rhetoric that we're probably going to seek vengeance. Because one thing Americans are better at or worse at than we like to admit about ourselves, we're pretty assertive, if not aggressive, and we certainly seek our vengeance. You don't attack the United States typically and get away with it. India turned the other cheek after Mumbai. We don't usually turn the other cheek. And so I think it's really important that we sustain these alliances and have U.S. military forces, not just as symbols of the alliance, but effectively as tripwires and as mechanisms that almost guarantee American involvement if those countries are attacked, which means Trump's comment that Putin should do whatever he wants against NATO countries not meeting 2% is a terrible sort of comment, especially if it's accompanied by troop withdrawals. So that would just be one that worries me about Trump. But as long as the forces stay forward stationed, I think we have a fairly decent chance of sustaining deterrence.
Well, good. I was worried we were going to have to end on a note of panic, but instead we will end on a note of searching for mechanisms that will help us all live in a world of reduced risk generally and certainly of reduced nuclear risk. So many thanks to our expert panel. Your comments are very much appreciated, and to the Brookings audience. We will look forward to seeing you next time. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.